And good morning, everybody. It's Friday. We made it through the week. Thank you for joining us this Friday for the Food Safety Chat. My name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group and the Food Foundation. And I'm here today joined by Kara Mikkelson-Baldus. How are you doing today, Kara?
Good. How are you, Bryan?
Good, doing well. So Kara is with Hydrite, and we're super glad to have her here because we're going to talk about a topic today that is really, it's a confusing topic, right? Sanitation and all the things around that. So this is going to be a good one. But before we jump into that, Kara, one of the things I always do, right, is I want to jump into the subject right away, but I'm not going to do that. So first off, what we're going to do is, please, everybody, this is kind of a cool format in that it's not like your normal presentations. If you're new to this is not a webinar where there's an expert who gives some slides and then you ask questions at the end. This is an interactive discussion. And the idea here every Friday is to bring up a different food safety topic and discuss it and chat about it and share information from an expert like Kara to help us improve our food safety programs. Because as we all know, food safety is not a point of competition. We're all in the same boat. And if one company within an industry has issues, it impacts us all. So we need to work together on these type of things. So this morning we are live streaming on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. So please, one of the things we like to do here, one of the traditions, and we got a couple of these, is to let us know where in the world you're at, because I am always amazed by this, Kara, of where people call in from, for this conversation, Turkey, Iran, Thailand, all around the world. So that's really awesome. I'm in Loveland, Colorado, which is about an hour north of the Denver metro area, if you're familiar with the United States. There's a Loveland ski resort as well, but I don't live up there in the mountains. A lot of the people in Colorado, if you're not familiar with the state, actually live along the base of the mountains, what we call the Front Range. And then on the weekends, we venture up into the mountains and then come back down. So that's kind of a little hint in Colorado life. So where in the world are you, Kara?
I am located in Oregon, Wisconsin, not the state Oregon. I am in Oregon. I get mixed up a lot. Not the state Oregon. I'm actually in Wisconsin, just south of Madison, Wisconsin.
Okay, yeah. So like me, if you're anybody who has worked in the dairy industry for any period of time, you spend most of it in California out in the valley, and the rest of it you're spending in Wisconsin. So I've definitely spent my fair share of time in Wisconsin.
Yeah. And now's the time to come to Wisconsin.
Oh yeah,
because it's beautiful.
I was out at a client in Pennsylvania this week, and they're getting ready for the leafers to come and watch the changing of the leaves and all that type of thing. So we're getting to that time of year.
Yep, absolutely, and it's great. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Helen, my friend, good to see you in Indiana. And Austin out here in Denver. Austin joined us a couple of weeks ago going over some of the things that his company is doing with Sage Media around food safety culture and training, which is amazing stuff. So really glad to have Austin here this morning. So please, everybody, as we're going here, let us know where you're at. And one of the big things with this program that you'll see here this morning is if you have questions or you have information you'd like to share, put it in the comments. And, of course, in the normal stream of conversation, there's points you can break in and there's points that aren't, but we keep an eye on that. And when we get to those questions, we want to get to them as quickly as possible. And Renee, my assistant, is here on as well. So good morning. And I guess actually good afternoon for you, Renee. But we will then put those in as well. So one of the things, and I almost jumped the gun on this. So one of our traditions here on the show is for us to all share a beverage together. And so mine is coffee. Do you have coffee or tea? What do you have?
I have coffee.
Coffee. Okay. So please, everybody, depending where you're at in the world, pick up your beverage and join us for a nice sip. Very nice. Very nice.
Awesome.
Sets the mood around this, right? And I'm gonna try and be clever with my transition. And in my clean coffee cup, right? So for sanitation. So Kara is an expert with Hydrite Chemical, and you are their food safety program manager. And as is often in the food industry, it's a tangled web, right? We all know each other and all these type of things. So there was a period of time where actually Kara and I worked together, and which was awesome. So I was at Eurofins, and then they acquired Covance, and we kind of all became part of the same team for a period of time, which was awesome. And you also were a microbiologist with Kraft.
Yes. Yeah. That's kind of where I started. Started with Oscar Mayer. I always say I grew up a meathead, initially, and then moved on into laboratory. So more laboratory setting with track microbiology and Covance urofins, etc. So
Ah.
yeah. Yeah, so a lot of, a lot of variety in my background.
Well, that's good, right? Those type of things help you get that bigger perspective, right? Because
Absolutely.
which is, I think, one of those key things that we need to do in the food industry. Because I mean, really, Carl, we don't do a good job of breaking down our silos. We, as people who aren't necessarily in the industry, but we're super tied to it, you kind of get a view of this. So the dairy people are doing their thing, and the meat people do their thing, the produce people do their thing, and they really don't talk to each other, which is too bad, because there's all kinds of good practices that they can share.
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, it's definitely, but everybody knows each other, right? So
Absolutely. So today, and this is good timing, because I was out at a client for their SQF audit, and this came up a lot. And I know it's something that people are concerned about. So we're tying this to SQF version 9. It's a nice, convenient way to talk about these things. But of course, within 21 CFR 117 with FSMA and all these type of things, there's lots of information and lots of data that auditors and regulatory agencies are looking for around sanitation. And really, Cara, I think one of the first things around that people get confused with is verification and validation. So when someone says, how did you validate your sanitation program? What do they mean?
So, and we'll just, I love definitions. I'm a definition girl. I like to understand, right? I'm real analytical that way. So you have monitoring, you have verification, and you have validation. And so validation is it the right thing to do? So is it controlling the identified hazard? And so, you kind of go back to HACCP and to the food safety or preventive controls regulation. As validation is it the right thing to do? Whereas verification, again, validation is an element of verification, but verification is, do I say what I do, and do I do what I say? So have I written it out? And then am I following those written plans? But first you have to validate. First you have to develop those plans, right? So validation gets you those parameters. So that's how I think of verification and validation. And then monitoring is just your activity to, it's the ongoing activity to ensure that you're maintaining that control. And then verification is that double check. Right, that double check of that. So
no, those are great definitions, right? So let me throw out an example here and see what you think of this, Cara. Is, let's say, your metal detector. So you buy a metal detector for your production line, and you spec it out, and you work with the company, and there's all of the attributes of the metal detector, right? All metal detectors aren't the same. And what you're trying to do is, when you work with the metal detector company, is you say, okay, here's my product. And they'll say, well, how big is your product? And what's its dimensions? And these type of things. And what that metal detector company is doing is saying, what is the smallest aperture I can create that product is going to go through? Because the smaller the aperture, the more sensitive that field is going to be. So for example, it's a lot easier to pick up, here we're using it, right? So this little chapstick, if you were running this through a metal detector, you have a very small aperture. If you're producing 50-pound bags of non-fat dry milk, right, that aperture is going to be very big as that bag goes through that. And then that ties to sensitivity. So for the standards that you run through, so your stainless steel, your ferrous, and your non-ferrous, those particle sizes are going to vary depending on that. And the metal detector company, when you buy that, comes in and sets all this up. They go through and they test your product, and they have the different wands, and then they figure out, here are the right sizes for you. This is the smallest you can pick up. Here's the little wands. Here's your information, and here's your certificates, and all these type of things. They have validated that will work for your process for metal detection. Then, to your point, those little wands are then the verification, right? So you set it up, and then you say, okay, I need to keep this on track. I'm going to use the little wands every hour to check and make sure and verify that it's working the way that those guys set it up. And to your point, then monitoring is the person who's running that process and watching that to make sure that everything is working the way it should. Is that a good
Yep. No, that's a great analogy. Yep, exactly. So yeah, and I think people, at least what I see, and perhaps you see this too, and again, this is my experience and my opinion, people use those terms interchangeably. And I think it's, to our due diligence to explain those terms and to really, have that clear definition.
Okay, exciting. We have a question here from Bruce. Can you see that on your side, Cara?
Yeah, and let's see, the use of it, and I wouldn't necessarily be the person to ask that, but I can get back to him with that information.
Yeah, and that's an important lesson in itself in food safety, right? Is that we don't have to be the repository of all information, right? The important thing is knowing who to talk to, right? There's experts who drill down into these really super specific topics and know more than we'll ever know.
Yep.
And knowing who to reach out to is super important. So Bruce, my advice, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, many times I call myself the operator. Like I connect the people to the right people. So.
And yep, that's the way to do it. And so, Bruce, my advice is, so Cara's email is on here. Send her a note. And then for the specifics on these particular chemicals as preservatives that you're looking at, they can get back to you on that.
Yep, absolutely.
Which is why having the support of your chemical company and your sanitation supplier is so important. Sanitation is not just you buy some stuff and you use it to clean, right?
Right.
Everybody is different. So just like in the metal detector example, Cara needs to know in your production facility what you're making. So you have fats and proteins and carbohydrates and excuse me, is your process, hot? Are things going to be baking on surfaces?
Yep.
Do you have CIP systems clean in place? Or are you going to be taking everything apart and cleaning it by hand? They need to know all of these type of things. Just like that metal detector technician who's coming in to set that up, Cara needs to do the same thing.
Yep, absolutely. And that's why to bring it back to sanitation validation, that's why you just need to, in validating your sanitation process, you need to understand there's so much that goes into it. Just understanding your equipment, understanding your product, your process, the different chemistries. There's a lot to it, and it isn't going to be necessarily in a nice neat box that we can just hand you, because it's something that you have to, or that somebody can hand you, because it's got to be something that you work with a lot of different people and work with a lot of different parameters in order to understand the scope of it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, quick story on that side. I was working in a large food company that was manufacturing soy milk, and then we started making almond milk.
Oh boy.
Yeah. On the same lines. So we had to be able to switch over and clean and go from a soy product to an almond product. And if anybody's seen, one of the base materials that you use for making almond milk is almond butter, right? So think peanut butter, only 10 times stickier.
Right.
And trying to clean that equipment, our chemical company, and working with us, and this took us months to figure out how to get it right and get the time down, invaluable, right? We wouldn't have been able to do that by ourselves.
Right. Yeah, it takes a lot of different people, engineers and your sanitation crew. It's very different. So it takes a lot of different perspectives. Somewhat like a food safety team or a HACCP team. When you're developing a food safety plan or a HACCP plan, you need that cross-functional membership, I guess you could say, in order to develop an appropriate plan. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because you need the engineering viewpoint to figure out flow rates and volumes, and when those spray nozzles are whipping around inside that tank, do they have enough flow rate? Are they using enough force in GPMs, gallons per minute, to be able to clean whatever's on those tanks off the sides?
Right.
And the engineers are going to think about that differently than other people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Bruce has another question here. Thanks for these, by the way, Bruce. We love these questions. Keep them coming. So, closer to topic, can you both comment on what I was taught a million years ago, that you need to switch between acid cleaning agents and basic cleaning agents to prevent buildup?
And so that is a really good question. And again, this one, I'm going to tell you the standard microbiologist answer. It depends, right? It depends on the soil. in real general terms, yeah, that's an appropriate type of cleaning program. But you'd really need to know exactly what the product is, the process is, in order to really determine exactly if that's what you need. Just because you also have to take into consideration the metals, the type of equipment that it is, so that you're not damaging the equipment with your chemistry too. So, but that's a great question, and once again, that's one where it's gonna depend, and it's not going to be a standard answer necessarily. So.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's a good point of how customized these type of things are, Cara. And so I was in an SQF audit this week to version 9, so the new version. So of course this is hot on my brain. And one of the questions that the auditor brought up is exactly what we're talking about. So this topic is perfect today, and this is something that's really in version 9 a lot. And he asked the question of, okay, you have a sanitation program, it's part of your preventive controls. Yes. Okay, how did you validate your sanitation, right? And
Right.
That is a big question.
It's a huge question. Yep. And you have to take a lot of things into consideration. You have to take into consideration. So what you have to do, really, remember, we're talking about validation, where is it the right thing to do? So we're trying to rid the system of soils and micro, right? And anything that was left behind. And so taking that into consideration. So what are all the parameters? And there's a whole boatload of parameters, right? It's equipment design, because where's stuff getting hung up? What's the hardest to reach point in the sanitation process for those chemicals? What are your chemicals? What is your process method to remove the dirt? Is it a CIP system? Is it manual cleaning? All those things. So and then testing. So if you're trying to validate it for removal of the microorganisms in your system, you got to consider, how many samples are you going to take? Because you have to develop that baseline and understand what's there and what's there after sanitation. And so you have to understand testing methodology. So that's why this is going to be a group effort for sure.
Well, definitely. I mean, God, you hit on so many things there. I mean, part of it too is how you sample. So are you using rinse water samples? Are you using surface samples? These type of things all come into play. The piece, I think, Cara, that confuses a lot of people from the chemical, usage standpoint, right, is you have sanitizers, you have cleaners, and different types of chemicals. And a question that comes up a lot, and the auditor asks this as well, is like, we'll use a sanitizer, for example. So how is a sanitizer approved for use in the food industry?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So sanitizers, sanitizer for use in food, are actually, they're EPA registered. So you go through a protocol in order to register a sanitizer for use for that food contact use. And then, but for food contact, you also have to get food contact notification through the FDA. So it's kind of a twofold event, but you do have to, for sanitizer claims, you need to have that EPA registration. And so it's a number that's on your label. And to boil it down to one simple sentence, with sanitizers, read your label. Read your sanitizer label, because everything's going to be on that label. So that's the most important thing that you can do for your sanitizers, in understanding your sanitizer.
Right, because they have to have a certain log reduction on that surface to show efficacy, correct?
Correct. Yep. And they do. And the EPA, there's EPA sanitizer efficacy protocols that must be conducted in order to achieve that sanitizer label. So that sanitizer registration. So read the label. That's the most important thing. And we say that all the time in our trainings. So read the label.
So go to the label. Is that information on the SDS or not?
No, it may be. I'm not totally sure, and I don't want to speak to that. But the label is where you're going to find the information for use and for efficacy on that label. So you want to make sure that you follow the label too for your sanitizer use.
So if I am a quality manager and I'm sitting in an audit and the inspector or the investigator or the auditor asks me that question of, okay, you're using this sanitizer X. How do you know that this is valid for this purpose? How would you answer that question for the auditor?
So you would point to your EPA registration. If it's a sanitizer, you would point to that EPA registration, because that is going to tell you that that sanitizer underwent the efficacy testing that's necessary to achieve that registration. Now, registration takes a long time to be able to get for sanitizers, so it is a lengthy process. But that's where you would point to that understanding. Now, the auditor may also ask, what you have to have records of what you're using it at, and it needs to align with that. The use needs to align with whatever's on the label, like how much you're using, where you're using it, things like that. So you need to make sure that you're following the label.
That's a good point. Very good point. So then too, there's also documents out there as well too that people could potentially use as reference material.
You mean sanitation validation?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yep. So I think, and I always mix up this acronym. It's the EHEDG. So the European Hygiene Engineering Design Group in 2016 put out a really nice validation guidance document, I guess you could say, that follows all different parameters that you can use. There is also a one from the FAO that was from, I think it was 2008, that has a little bit of information. There's lots of information out there, though, that, there's trade groups and things like that have put out information. The thing that I want to stress is just, and again, my opinion and my experience, just understand what you're trying to achieve, understand the scope and the parameters that are necessary to justify, right? What are you trying to achieve? And with validation, you're trying to achieve, is it the right thing to do? Are you controlling the hazard, which is removing that micro or removing that soil? And so make sure that you're able to justify that through your data.
Right. And then you need to verify in some way as well too. So swabs or inspections and sampling and these type of things. The important part of this is, and this is something I always tell my quality managers, Cara, is you need to be able to tell your story. It's not enough when the auditor or the regulators, they're sitting with you and they ask you this question around validation to just hand them a document, right? You need to explain to them why you do what you do. And what's important that people forget on this too, Cara, is why you don't do other things, right? It may not be appropriate for your function. So you need to be able to defend both of those.
Right. Exactly. Yep. Exactly. And it's important to understand why you're doing things. I know, and again, my, previous experience in laboratories and things, sometimes people, are conducting the test, but not sure what they're doing or why they're doing it. It's important to understand the why, right? And understand, again, the justification. It's about justifying why you're doing something, or like you say, why you're not doing something.
That's perfect. I love how you put that. So I did put a link in there for everybody for the document that Cara mentioned. There's another one as well too, the documents from the FAO. And if you'd like to get a copy of that, we have a PDF of that. So you can just send an email to either myself or Cara, and we'll fire that over to you. So we had a question here from Maria. After compiling the data and analyzing it, any suggestions to write the validation report or must have information?
Yeah. And so, okay, I'm a pretty analytical person again, and I'm probably to a fault. I get made fun of for having too many words in my emails. But
So what do the kids say? TLDR, right? Too long.
Yeah. Yeah. That's me, and I embrace it. So, but that, outline, it's a protocol, right? Outline your protocol, outline and explain why, use your references like we gave you here. and that is really, now I know in that and the European hygiene design, they do have a short section on reporting, validation report and writing up the report. So that might be a good reference for you. But again, make sure you outline the scope. And again, and again, this is my opinion and my experience, but even bad data is data. And you need to understand what that means for your process and not that there's bad data, there really isn't, it's data, right? But you need to understand how that fits into your overall protocol. And so, what should you include? What shouldn't you include? Look at your protocol, define your protocol ahead of time. And then, you should be able to define what might not fit into the protocol necessarily, but most of the time, most of the data that, almost the data that you collect is going to end up in that report. So.
Right. Yep, absolutely. And so my assistant Renee put a link in here. We have a group on Locals, and if you're not familiar with Locals, it's this really cool platform for sharing information where we list recalls and these type of activities around food safety, and it's free. So if you're interested in signing up for that and keeping up to date on what's going on, which is an important piece of this, right? You need to keep up to date because these things change all the time. Feel free to hit that link and join us on Locals. We'd love to have you. So it's very interesting. This is the validation piece of it. So we've been talking about the sanitizers, and there's the process you go through with EPA and the efficacy, and these have to be registered. This is this really long process to do these things. What about other things we're using, right? So we're using detergents and cleaners and caustics and these type of things. Do they go through the same process?
No, they don't go through the same process, but what you need to understand with those cleaners and things like that is that if they are not registered, then they can't make those sanitizer claims. So you need to have that EPA registration to have those sanitizer claims. And the EPA does have a list, and I can send those links to you on the EPA about what claims are for cleaners and what claims bump you into sanitizers. And that's something where you really have to be careful, because if you do not follow those protocols for the efficacy and the registration, then you can't make those claims as a sanitizer. So there's certain things, and that's, you have to be very careful about how you term that type of information. So
the cleaners don't go through the same process.
Not the same efficacy studies that the EPA registration requires for sanitizers. So.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, the sanitizers is kind of the important process, right? And so
again, and this is just a little, and this is where it gets, you just got to get a really good regulatory person, because also like hand cleaners and sanitizers fall to FDA because it's a different category. So just so you know, you want to make sure that you can, you define all that. And I don't want to make a broad blanket statement that way, but I want people to understand that. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I mean, and part of it too, right, is the overall sanitation process. So part of working with a chemical company and setting these type of things up is all these parameters. So you need to understand, all right, here is the first step in the process where we remove all of the big pieces of material from the equipment. And then here's the next step in the process where we go through foaming, and we're going to do some manual agitation on the surfaces. And then the next step is rinsing that. Then the next is a cleaning step. And then the final thing afterwards, right, is that sanitizing step. And understanding all those parameters, because that's all tied to flow rates and temperatures and concentrations and contact time and all kinds of complicated stuff.
Absolutely. Yep. And it all makes a difference, right? In your validation and then your verification activities, because those are gonna be what you look for in your verification activities for the most part. Again, depends, but
and here's another little wrinkle people need to think about as well too, is the type of certifications you have. So if you are organic, for example, there's limitations and different things you need to do relative to that as well. So you need to think about those too.
Yep, absolutely. It can get, and that's where it's good to work with, a variety of different people to make sure that that you have the most updated information and information that's applicable to your process. So.
Yep, absolutely. Helen makes a good point here. I think sanitizers are making a claim that they kill organisms. Cleaning and acids are only meant to remove residues.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, perfect.
Yep.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yep.
I mean, so part of this too, right, is some of the challenges we have in the food industry, like organisms that form biofilms, right? So you need to have an effective way to get that protective coating off of those bacteria that are kind of all snuggled in there, so that you can strip that off, and then the sanitizer can go get them.
Right. You got to be careful, because there's certain claims that you can make about removal and kill biofilms, and ensure that your product is aligned to those claims.
So here's kind of a question that just popped in my head too. So I think this kind of gets back to some of the things that were being talked about earlier with Bruce. So sometimes too, in food plants, you will rotate, right? You will have different sanitizers that you use, and you'll rotate those out on a different schedule, right?
Sometimes, yeah. It kind of depends again on the product and the process. If people will sometimes do that, not necessarily though either. It just kind of depends on the product and the process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my background's dairy, so I mean, so the cultures and the bacteria, the good bacteria that you're using in the process to create the cheese curd and create that pH drop and all those things with cheese making, you don't want to hurt those guys,
right?
So the same goes with like if you're making beer or anything like this, right, where you have a culture. If you have a sanitizer that's super duper aggressive, and let's say it's hanging around, and you then introduce cultures into that tank and it kills them all, well, that's not good either.
That could be a problem, right? So, yeah, and that's where you just have to work. Again, the product and the process are going to depend on what type of chemistry you're going to want to apply to your system.
So I think, the bottom line on that side is you just can't go to a catalog and say, okay, I'll buy some cleaner and I'll buy some of this and I'll get a sanitizer and I'll use those and everything is good. Oh, and by the way, if I use more than the label says, that means it's going to work better. Right?
Yeah, no, that is. Please don't use the glug method, right? That's what I call. That's my opinion. That's what I call it. Follow your label, because it's on there for specified reasons, right? So.
Yeah. Well, and as you mentioned earlier too, some chemicals can damage your equipment. So, for example, if you have aluminum parts and you're using chlorine solution as your sanitizer, you're going to damage that metal, and it's going to pit over time, and you're going to create more of a problem, because now you've created these little niches where the bacteria can hang out. So you're actually in the long run hurting yourself.
Yep, exactly. Yep. More is not always better. And also you got to know your type of chemistry. And there are chemistries for soft metals and that are appropriate. And again, it's going to depend on the type of process and product you're producing. So
absolutely. And Catherine says the same thing here. So know the type of cells you are trying to remove: protein, fat, and influence efficacy.
Absolutely.
100%.
Yeah,
you got it. So so strategically, what are we trying to do here from a quality food safety standpoint is you want to have what I call good bookends, right? So you have a manufacturing process and you go through and you do your thing, and then you switch to your sanitation process and you rinse and you clean and you sanitize, and then you verify that all worked, and then you start the process over again. Now throw on top of that allergens and whatever, and you're switching over those different things. You have to be able to prove that you had a discrete window of time. So if you do have a problem, and hopefully you don't, you can then go back and isolate it and say, okay, yep, on this production day, we did have a problem with this. I'm confident that this problem didn't continue on because I've got nice, solid sanitation bookends where I can clearly show that, yep, everything stopped at this point. Because a lot of times, Cara, when you see a recall in the market and FDA says so-and-so had a recall, FDA then, in the meantime, has gone into that plant and started asking lots and lots of questions. And sometimes you'll see, and this is kind of the worst case scenario, a few weeks later where so-and-so has expanded their recall. And that's because FDA has come in and those beginning and end sections within that plant weren't as good as they thought.
Right. Yep. And we see that time and time again, right? And that's where it comes down to, again, I kind of alluded to it in talking about the validation report. documentation is key, and understanding and really keeping good documentation practices and records is going to help you narrow the scope of a recall, and bad is going to help expand it.
Yes, absolutely. And so this validation report that you're talking about, who's creating this report? Is it, who's responsible for it? Is it the plant? Is it the company you're working with? How does that work?
Generally speaking. Now, again, it's going to depend, but you are going to be responsible for your validation report and demonstrating that your process is, your sanitation process is effective in removing those soils and getting those microbes out of that process, right? So it doesn't, again, I refer back to like PCQI training. I do a lot of PCQI training, and it's not always the quality manager, but or the sanitation manager, but it can be. But it should be a team of people. In my opinion, it should be a team of people, because you need all of those different angles to your report, right? Different departments.
And that's, yeah, I mean, that's a super important point. You have a food safety team, right? And you have a team for a purpose. And so you need to put really strong safeguards in place that, hey guys, and make sure that you're hitting the drumbeat on this, and the team is really aware of this, that if anything changes in the plant,
right,
we know about it on the food safety team so that we can prepare for it. So I've been involved with this more than once. Is you'll walk into a production facility and be like, hey, that's a new piece of equipment. Where'd that come from? And a lot of times it'll just show up. The corporate engineering group bought some piece of equipment on a super hot deal, and now all of a sudden it's in your plant. And a lot of times, the people who buy the equipment from an operational standpoint, not always, but sometimes, will look at it and say, okay, we want a piece of equipment that is really fast, right? It's operationally efficient. But what people forget to ask, Cara, is how do I clean it? So now you've got this piece of equipment sitting in the plant that no one knows how to clean.
Yep. More than once, Bryan, more than once. So yeah. And I see, Catherine just said culture matters. Food safety culture matters. It's an important aspect of all of this, right? All of our programs. So
yep, absolutely. And that's a message that the food safety team needs to just constantly beat on, is nothing relative to food safety in this plant changes without our prior approval, right? It needs to go through us in order to make these changes, because it's just too important.
Right. And it's a team effort, like you say. It's a team effort, and you need that understanding too. So I think that's important.
Definitely, absolutely. So so with the SQF standard, I think we've definitely hit around that sanitation piece of it, right? So of course, sanitation is a preventive control, which means, right, it's really important in your process. And that's definitely something I've seen in food safety plans now, is that companies that fall under that umbrella have really, in most cases, from your HACCP plan, now you've got your food safety plan, they've really moved away from CCPs, right? They have the preventive controls, right? So you have your allergens, your foreign material, crisis management if you're ready to eat, sanitation, right? And talking about those in those terms. Because to your point, Cara, and I really like that you brought this up several times, because it's so important. Everything is based upon what you're doing, right? And you need to develop it and explain it. So that's super important.
Yeah, exactly. So
now let's see. So if I look at the SQF standard, they talk about validation 8 times in the standard, right? So they're talking about it under allergens.
They're serious, right?
Yeah, and cleaning and sanitation, it's all over the place, right? So 11.2.5 in the standard around cleaning and sanitation is exactly what we're talking about here, right? What's to be cleaned? How's it being cleaned? When do you need to clean it? Who's responsible for it? And then they call out a specific line under 5, validation of the cleaning procedures for food contact surfaces, including CIP, right? It is BAM, right there.
Right. So you need to be able to demonstrate that. And how are you going to demonstrate that? And, if you think back to HACCP, and it's been around a while, with validation of CCPs, there's really kind of those 2 elements where you have like the theoretical, so the peer-reviewed journal articles that demonstrate, certain aspects or certain parameters are effective in your CCPs, so let's say your thermal, and then you do it in plant testing, right? So kind of that theoretical gives you that jumping point, those parameters that you're going to potentially set, and then you get those in plant demonstrations, which is what we've been talking about here. So with all those, the methodology, the design, the identifying your soils. That was an awesome comment. All of that plays in, and the justification. So, but the first thing is understand what you're trying to justify, right? Understand what's the scope of your validation. So.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So Austin brings up something here in Colorado that we're very familiar with, is so the big listeria issue with the cantaloupe with Jensen Farms and those things. So yeah, part of their equipment they were using that was for potatoes, right?
Right.
Potato washes for cantaloupe, right? Improper use, right? And they thought they were doing a good job of cleaning the cantaloupe, and it turned out, unfortunately, that there weren't, and people got sick and died from it.
Yeah. Yep. Understand your equipment and how easy or hard it is, right, to clean.
Exactly. So, I mean, oh boy, yeah, a ton to think about here on a Friday morning. So let's kind of bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level, Cara. So I'm a quality manager, part of a food safety team in a manufacturing plant, and I've just listened to all this information. I'm like, oh, geez, man, this is a
holy cow, my head's gonna blow.
Yeah, where do I start? What are some of your recommendations around that for people?
Yep. And so where I would start is just, it is Food Safety Education Month this month. I'm a big proponent of getting educated, right? So if you have no idea what validation or verification is, start educating yourself on that. And like that European hygiene document, that's going to give you just a real good, again, we're bringing up 30,000 feet here. That's a great 30,000 foot kind of level for you. That's where I would start, is just educating yourself about exactly what it is. And, and then reach out to experts and have those conversations. Your laboratory, if you have a food safety consultant or an internal food safety expert or anything like that, reach out to them. What exactly are what do you need to look for? Because this isn't going to just be a process where you do it overnight either. And I don't want to give that indication. You're not gonna walk away from this talk with a protocol. Unfortunately, I know everybody's like, darn it. Like, come on, man. But educate yourself and understand what it takes to put together that report, and the different elements of that report. And that's going to involve reaching out to people and getting that information. So.
Right. Well, and I think, Cara, that's a great point, because that brings it home to kind of one of our Achilles heels on what we do as quality managers and food safety professionals, is we think we have to know it all, right? And we have to be able to recite it from memory and do all the research and have this all self-contained. That's 100% not true. So reach out and talk with those experts who know these things inside and out. They live and breathe it. People like Cara in the Hydrite chemicals and companies like this, who can help you, right? Because they want to help you set up these programs correctly. Everybody wants safe food, right? And part of that is collaborating around these type of things, which is why we do these talks on Friday, because it's so important to get the word out here for these things, right? We need to collaborate more if we're going to get better, right? Every year we hear these type of questions. Oh, geez, recalls are up again. Why? Well, it's because we need to share this information and learn from each other to avoid these things from happening in the first place. And sanitation, number one, right? That's where it all starts.
Right. Yeah. I always like to think, and in my opinion, I guess I'm biased, right? I think sanitation is one of the most important things that you can do in your processing facility. But again, yeah, and you have to have that. I'm a huge phone a friend person. I like having friends. So please figure out, so collaborate. Please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm going to reach out to you. I do believe that. I think you're spot on. Everybody, you can't know everything, right? You can't know everything. And having those connections and those networks, I know for me, even my, my days just right out of college, I still reach out to those people for information. So, and help, right? We all need, we all need to lean on each other. So.
Yep, absolutely. We're all in the same boat together, guys. Food safety is a team effort. So those company boundaries for food safety really don't apply, right? Because a recall in one industry impacts everybody else in that industry. And that's how the consumers view us, right? And to a point that came up last week, right, is we take this for granted in the United States. And if we travel to a foreign country, all of a sudden we know that trust is gone, right? So we're very, very careful then in foreign countries what we eat. And that's because the trust is lacking.
Right. Yeah. Well, and collaboration for us is, important, at least, in our food safety industry. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So great comments. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Bryan Ravitch, good to see you again, too, my friend. Always great to have you on these talks. We're here every Friday, right? So at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern. And Renee, my assistant, is in the comment section here. Friend him on LinkedIn here. He puts together a weekly event so that you can be reminded when these things come up. So you don't have to rely on just happening to be on LinkedIn at the right time and a message pops up saying that we're going live. Because being here and participating and being able to ask questions of experts like Cara is super, super valuable, right? You don't get that opportunity very often. So we're really pleased and amazing information today. So hopefully that helps everybody out. Thank you, Cara. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I'm sure we could talk forever on it.
Oh, absolutely. So everybody, please join us back here next Friday at the same time, and we'll tackle a new subject. But in the meantime, enjoy the fall, get out and see those leaves, have a great weekend, and then we'll start again on Monday. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Have a good weekend, Cara.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Thanks, everyone.